My name is Larry Ray. I'm Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research. The title of my presentation is The Future of Violence, or more particularly, how we should interpret trends in violence at both international and local levels. Now, there is, I think, a widely held view that we live in violent times. The world systems theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, for example, says that a high degree of violence is erupting everywhere in smaller and larger doses and over relatively long periods of time. And this is probably a widely held view that is encouraged, no doubt, by 24/7 media coverage, which focuses particularly and inevitably on global conflicts and on crime. Now, on the other hand, over the last few years, there's been a strongly argued thesis that actually this perception is wrong, that we live in increasingly peaceful times, perhaps some of the most peaceful times in human history. And this is the question I want to examine today. Now, if we go back 25 years or so, one of the most significant events of the later 20th century was the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And it was a largely unanticipated event, symbolized particularly by the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. And this largely unanticipated event prompted a great deal of reflection on what kind of world we were emerging into. And there were, very roughly speaking, the optimists who saw a world of increasing peace and integration, and the self-styled realists, or perhaps pessimists, who saw a world of increasing conflict and war. So on the one hand, amongst the optimists, there was the idea that this brought the end of the end of ideological conflict. The American philosopher Francis Fukuyama, for example, talked about the end of history. Globalization was a term that was already in use then, but really comes into its own after the end of the Cold War and for the following 20 years or so. Advocates of globalization argue that increasing interconnectedness will bring increasing peace and prosperity and an increasingly similar social, political and economic system across the world. There would be new European unity across East and West, bringing in the former communist countries into the European Union, a project that, of course, we know now has become rather more problematic. But particularly important for my purposes is also this was to signal the end of interstate war. The sociologist Anthony Giddens, for example, said, "Who are the enemies of Britain, France or Japan? Nations today face risks and dangers, but not enemies." And this is a massive shift in their nature. So the end of interstate war at the end of the 20th century would be part and parcel of a decline in violence. On the other hand, the realists, like Samuel Huntington, sociologist, argued that we would see a clash of civilizations, particularly between the West and Islam. That the so-called post-Westphalian system of nation-states that had emerged in the 17th century would increasingly fragment with multiple conflicts. The American journalist Robert Kaplan talked about the coming anarchy, the classificatory grid of nation-states being replaced by a jagged glass pattern of city-states, shanty-states and nebulous anarchic realisms. New technologies would facilitate new conflicts and possibly new atrocities. And particularly important during this period was the threat of the rise of ethnically based nationalism, such as occurred in the Yugoslavian civil war. Now, on the peace camp, or on the optimist camp, one of the strongest theses arguing that there was in fact a decline in violence came from Steven Pinker, the Harvard evolutionary psychologist, who in the best-selling book Better Angels of Our Nature argues that the most important thing that has ever happened in human history is that violence has declined over long stretches of time, and today we may be living in the most peaceful period of our species' existence. He accumulates a great deal of evidence for this thesis, although perhaps somewhat selectively, but the thesis itself is not particularly new. After the Enlightenment, many philosophers and social theorists argued that with a world of increasing interconnectedness and increasing rationality, there would be a decline in violence. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued this, the sociologist Herbert Spencer, and many others. And this thesis was particularly advanced by the 20th century sociologist Norbert Elias, who in 1939 published Über den Prozess der Zivilisation, in which he argued that across several hundred years, from the Middle Ages through to the modern period, there'd been a gradual decline in violence that was linked to a number of factors, but including increased repugnance to violence. We no longer find it Saturday afternoon entertainment to watch public executions or animals being tortured. This was linked to interhuman empathy, increased feeling for other humans and indeed animals. This was also linked to the growth of the state and pacification brought by state control of violence. But Elias was a Jewish emigre from Nazi Germany, where both his parents died, and he emphasized that this was a fragile and reversible process, something that I will return to at the end of this presentation. So, what kind of evidence is there for the decline of violence thesis? Have we, as the prophet Isaiah suggested, begun to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks? Well, there is actually a considerable amount of evidence for this view. For example, the historical criminologist Manuel Eisner has for some time been collecting evidence of declining homicides in many European countries from the early modern period of the 14th century through to the present day. This data is from an early paper of his in 2001, where he shows the steep decline in homicide in several European countries across the 14th and 16th century, declining very steeply by the end of the 20th century. There is a slight increase in the later 20th century, but if 21st century figures were added to this, it would continue to decline. And beneath this trend, there's also a significant change in the nature of violence. There's a decline in male confrontation violence, pub brawls and so on, but therefore a proportionate increase in domestic violence, therefore a changed gendered victimization. And the gendered dynamics of violence are very important. At an international level, there's been a steep decline in battle death from the mid-20th century, the period of catastrophic bloodletting of world wars and the Holocaust, gradually declining through the later 20th century as colonial wars ended and interstate wars declined to the point that by the end of the 20th century they had disappeared. And the Human Security Brief, which monitors battle death globally, argued that there is reason to believe the historical decline in violence is both real and substantial. One can also look at how changing patterns of how conflicts end. There's a significant growth in the second half of the 20th century in conflicts ending through negotiation, such as the peace process in Northern Ireland, and a reduction in conflicts ending in outright victory, although conflicts ending in negotiation may not be quite as stable as other conflict resolutions. So there is evidence to support an end of violence thesis or a decline in violence thesis. However, there are a number of things that we should note to the contrary. For example, part of Elias's thesis was that there is an increasing sensibility, an increasing repugnance towards violence, yet in the last 20 or so years we've seen a sharp rise in the aestheticization of violence. Violence as entertainment, fantasy violence admittedly. There is debate of course about the relationship between fantasy violence and real violence. But the possibility that our sensibility to violence is being reduced is something that should be seriously considered in these debates, and it isn't often referred to. Then again, there's the role of the state. The state is a bringer of pacification, of law and order, But at the same time, the state is itself coercive. And one of the things we see in the later 20th century is a steep rise in the proportion of people in prison. So the British prison population between 1951 and 2015 rose from 90 to 170 per 100,000 of the population. Interestingly, particularly during the 1990s, which was a period of declining crime. So punishments are becoming more severe. The UK also has one of the largest detention of non-criminal population in Europe in immigration and asylum detention centres. However, rates in the UK, prison rates in the UK have not yet reached the United States levels of 724 per 100,000 of the population. Again, if we return to international conflicts, the nature of victimisation has changed. A report from the United Nations on sexual violence in conflict argues that victims of modern armed conflict are far more likely to be civilians than soldiers, the vast majority of these amongst women and children. Women in particular, they say, can face devastating forms of sexual violence which are sometimes deployed systematically to achieve military or political objectives. So again, the nature of victimisation, and particularly the gendering of victimisation, has changed in the modern period. Some sources claim that 90% of deaths in wars since 1990 have been civilian, although this figure is disputed by other sources such as the Human Security Report. But this is an important issue for any debate about increasing civilization and civilianization, any debate about the declining role of the military in modern society, is the changing pattern of victimization. Another important issue here is the way violence is concentrated and the way violence is geographically and spatially concentrated. So the Global Terrorism Index, for example, claims that between 2000 and 2014 there's been a 9-fold increase in deaths from terrorism, and indeed that many countries in the past 2 years experienced a terrorist incident of some kind, but nonetheless these have been concentrated in a few countries, not surprisingly, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria and Syria. So although there has been an increase in terrorist incidents and deaths worldwide, some of these, of course, close to home, which we are very aware of, nonetheless, these deaths have been highly geographically, spatially concentrated. And we see the same pattern in relation to recorded crime. For example, the London Metropolitan Police reports of serious violent incidents so far in 2016 show a marked spatial patterning. So some areas of London, those shaded red and orange, indicate high levels of reported serious incidents, whereas other levels much lower, and the blue areas are virtually none. And this patterning and distribution often coincides with high levels of deprivation and inequality. So violence is highly geographically and spatially concentrated. So where do these reflections leave the opening questions about the nature of the world that is emerging or has emerged since the end of communism? Well, in some respects, the post-1989 peace camp and war camp are both right in limited ways. There has been a decline in violence, measured, for example, by a decline in interstate conflicts, but this needs to be weighed against the high spatial differentiation of violence, the geographical distribution of violence, both globally and within countries. We also need to be aware of changing modalities of violence, and particularly changing gendered patterns of victimisation, which I referred to. Therefore, what we probably need are spatial and specific theories of conflict and violence, rather than simply looking at overarching trends, as interesting as these might be in many respects. And finally, when I referred to Norbert Elias earlier, I emphasised that he saw a civilizing process as fragile and reversible. And we've seen in the months since the EU referendum in Britain a steep increase, some recorded a 56% increase in xenophobic and racist violence, including at least one racist murder. And this should serve as a warning that pacification and cosmopolitanism can give way to the politics of resentment and violence. This does not yet constitute a trend, and we very much hope it doesn't do so, but it does constitute a warning. Thank you very much for listening.